Hello everyone. If your day has been loud, let this be the quiet after the storm. Set down the weight you carried here. Breathe in, slowly, and let it go. Tonight, we won't chase heroes or arguments. We'll listen for softer things, footsteps in a long corridor, the hush of a distant lamp, the faint rustle of time turning a page. You are safe here. Nothing asks for effort. Nothing hurries you. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell me in the comments, perhaps a small town, a city window, a quiet room with the lights low. If this gentle kind of history helps you rest, you can subscribe and stay with us again. Whenever the night feels heavy, close your eyes. Let the breath slow. A door opens to an older world, and we step through unafraid, unhurried together. The night is breathless. Beyond the walls of a crumbling villa, the fields lie still beneath a pale Roman moon. June 68 AD, the air carries the scent of rain and dust, of earth still warm from a fading day. Inside, in the half-light of a dying oil lamp, a man once called divine sits motionless. His robes, once heavy with gold thread, now cling to his skin like rags. The emperor of the world is afraid to move. Somewhere far off, a dog barks and falls silent. The silence that follows feels infinite, thick enough to hear one's own heartbeat. Nero listens, holding his breath, as if the night itself might betray him. For years he commanded armies, built palaces, burned cities, and made Rome dance to his voice. Now, even the shadows seem to whisper his name in mockery. A cracked mirror leans against the wall. In its reflection, he sees a face swollen by sleeplessness, pale, bloated, streaked with tears. He lifts his trembling hand to his throat, where the pulse flutters beneath skin that once bore the kisses of queens. Qualis artifex perio. He murmurs to no one, "What an artist dies in me." The words drift into the darkness like a sigh that does not belong to a god, but to a man who finally knows what it means to be forgotten. Around him, the villa creaks with the weight of its secrets. Outside, his companions whisper a freedman, a scribe, a servant, and a boy still dressed as a woman. They are the last audience to his tragedy, waiting for an emperor who no longer remembers how to act. The faint glow of the lamp trembles across the room, painting his features in gold and shadow. It looks, for a moment, like the stage lighting he once loved. The great performer, sitting in silence, rehearsing his final scene. He remembers the roar of the crowd at the theater, the sea of faces lit by torchlight, the applause that once washed over him like wine. He had believed then that love could be commanded, that devotion could be sculpted from fear. But fear has its own language, and tonight it answers him in whispers through the cracks of the wall, in the rustle of soldiers drawing nearer. Outside, horses stamp the ground. The wind carries the sound of metal, the echo of armor. Every creak of the wooden beams above him sounds like a sentence being written by fate. He knows they will find him soon. Rome no longer belongs to him. It belongs to the silence after his name. Nero presses his palms together as if in prayer, though he has never known how to pray. Not to gods, not to men. He thinks of his mother's voice, cold and commanding, of his wife's eyes before she fell to the marble floor, of his city, burning and beautiful. All of it feels distant now, like music fading into another room. A drop of oil slides down the wick. The flame shrinks to a small, trembling point. The air smells of smoke and iron, of ending. The emperor closes his eyes. For a heartbeat, he imagines that the applause will begin again, that Rome will rise, that the stage will glow once more. But the world has gone quiet. The only sound is his breath, shallow and uneven, echoing in the vastness of a dying empire. This is how history sometimes ends, not with a roar, not with fire, but with a man whispering to himself in the dark, The candle flickers one last time. Then the room goes still. The sea was the first sound he ever heard. Not the cry of his mother, nor the voices of servants, but the rhythm of the tide against the rocks of Antium, that quiet town where the salt wind brushed the marble villas and morning mist gathered over the fields. It was December 15th, 37 AD, when Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus came into the world, the child who would one day be called Nero. The dawn that day was pale and patient. The sky, heavy with the color of unpolished silver, held the hush of something ancient watching. A handful of attendants moved softly about the room, their sandals whispering against the floor. They did not speak loudly. Even the midwife's hands seemed cautious, as though she were handling a piece of history that might shatter at a breath. Outside, the sea rolled on. The waves were indifferent, the same rhythm that had carried the ships of Caesar, the same wind that had once filled the sails of the gods' temples. The child's first cry rose and faded into that eternal pulse, swallowed by time itself. His mother, Agrippina the younger, lay still, her hair damp against her temples, her eyes sharp even in exhaustion. She looked at the infant with the gaze of someone who already knew the price of bloodlines. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the niece of Caligula, two names that shimmered in gold and bled in red. Power was the inheritance of her veins, and danger was its twin. Around them, the walls of the villa glowed faintly in the dawn. Mosaics depicting Neptune and Venus caught the first light, their faces calm, eternal, indifferent. Somewhere a servant offered a prayer, not to celebrate the birth, but to protect the house from what this birth might bring. For in Rome, every child of noble blood was a potential omen, a spark that could warm or burn the world. The newborn slept, his small fists curling against the folds of linen. No one dared to call him beautiful. Beauty in Rome was a curse when mixed with destiny. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a man known for cruelty and arrogance, whose own tongue had already condemned his son before the boy could walk. "Nothing born of Agrippina and myself could be anything but cursed," he once said. Perhaps he was right, though the gods had their own sense of irony. In that house by the sea, whispers of lineage hung thicker than incense. Each name in the child's ancestry carried a shadow. Great generals who rode through Gaul with severed heads swinging from their saddles. Emperors who poisoned brothers at their own tables. Women who smiled as kingdoms fell. The blood of gods and monsters mingled freely in his cradle. The historian might say that the empire shaped him. That circumstance forged his cruelty. But here, in the soft dawn of his first morning, there was only stillness. A child, a mother, and the sea. The wind moved through the open shutters, stirring the linen like a sigh. The mother's gaze softened, just for a moment, and she whispered something only the walls would hear. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a promise. Outside, the first gulls rose into the light, their wings flashing against the horizon. The sun touched the sea and turned it gold. The world did not yet know the name that would one day make it tremble. It was simply another morning on the Italian coast, quiet, innocent, and brief. But history was already watching. In that gentle light, a dynasty breathed again, the old gods stirring, the ancient wounds reopening. The boy slept, unaware that he had inherited not a life, but a legacy. And far away, Rome itself seemed to turn in its sleep, as if sensing that something or someone had just entered the story. She learned early that power could wear a smile. Agrippina, the younger daughter of blood and empire, grew up among marble halls, where tenderness was a language few spoke. Her mother had been exiled. Her brother, Caligula, would become emperor. Her uncles, generals, and gods to the people. From childhood, she breathed in ambition the way others breathe in air. It clung to her skin, sweet and poisonous, like the perfume of Rome itself. She was born into a world where beauty was a weapon sharper than any blade. The Romans wrote of her eyes cool, calculating, impossible to read. To those who met her gaze, it felt less like being seen than being measured, weighed, and silently dismissed or spared. She was not cruel for sport, she was cruel for survival. When her brother Caligula took the throne, she watched from the edges of his madness. The empire, swollen with its own glory, trembled under his whims, executions ordered between meals, marriages broken like glass. Agrippina learned the value of stillness. While others shouted or pleaded, she remained silent, her composure, her armor. To live near power, she understood, one must become as smooth and cold as the marble it sits upon. But silence did not mean surrender. She watched the tides of politics the way sailors watch the sea, noting every change in the wind, every tremor in the current. When Caligula's paranoia grew too wild, she was accused of conspiracy and banished to a barren island in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Many thought she would die there. Yet exile only refined her, sanded her softness into resolve. She would sit by the shore and watch the waves break against the rocks, thinking of Rome, of her son, and of the empire that had tried to forget her. The sea became her mirror, beautiful, merciless, and patient. Years passed. The empire changed emperors as easily as a woman changes robes. When Claudius came to power after Caligula's assassination, the court reshuffled itself like a deck of gilded cards. Agrippina returned from exile with nothing but her name, and her name was enough. Rome loved her lineage, even when it feared her presence. In public, she was grace embodied. Her walk was measured, her words chosen as if weighed on scales of consequence. Every gesture seemed effortless, yet behind each movement lay calculation. She could disarm a senator with a smile, make a rival vanish with a rumor. Those who underestimated her found themselves quietly erased from the story. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. In a world ruled by men, her silence spoke louder than their decrees. At banquets, she sat apart, neither too near the emperor to seem ambitious, nor too far to seem forgotten. The jewels she wore were modest but deliberate, each a whisper of her ancestry, each a reminder that she carried the blood of Augustus himself. The Roman people admired her restraint, but beneath that elegance burned an unyielding fire, the certainty that destiny had chosen her line, her son. And so, her thoughts returned always to him, Lucius, the boy she had left behind during her exile. He was her redemption, her weapon, her second chance at the throne she had once watched slip away. She saw in him both the softness of youth and the raw clay of empire. She would shape him carefully, molding him with stories of divine blood and rightful rule, teaching him that affection was a weakness, but control was love. In quiet moments, she would sit with him near the gardens of Rome, the air thick with the scent of cypress and myrrh. Her hand would rest lightly on his shoulder, and her voice, low, melodic, almost tender, would speak of destiny. "You were born for more than men can imagine," she would whisper, "but you must never forget even the gods bow to those who wait." To outsiders, she seemed the perfect mother, devoted, dignified, protective, yet beneath her gentleness moved the machinery of empire. Every favor, every friendship, every gesture toward her son was a step in a design no one else could see. When she smiled at him, it was both blessing and command. When she kissed his forehead, it was both love and prophecy. In time, she would find her way back to the palace, to the same corridors that had once expelled her. She would marry the richest men in Rome, widowed by coincidence or cunning. Each union brought her closer to the seat of power, and when the widowed Emperor Claudius hesitated to choose his next empress, Agrippina's shadow fell quietly across his hesitation. She did not rush. She let the rumor spread first, that she was beautiful, that she was wise, that she was no threat. By the time she appeared before him, veiled in mourning black, her presence felt inevitable, like winter arriving after autumn's last sigh. Claudius, older and weary, saw in her what she wanted him to see: loyalty, grace, comfort. The Senate protested their union. Roman law forbade it. But Agrippina knew what emperors always forget. Laws are fragile things when power is at stake. In the marble hall where they were wed, torches flickered softly against the walls. The crowd murmured blessings. Only Agrippina's eyes remained still. She had returned from exile to stand at the heart of empire once more. But as the vows were spoken, a faint chill moved through the air, like a whisper of ghosts stirring. For though her dream was dressed in silk and gold, it carried the scent of iron underneath. Somewhere deep inside, perhaps she felt it, that a mother's dream, when fed by power, begins to eat itself. That love, when sharpened into ambition, turns into the blade that cuts both ways. But she would not turn back. She would walk forward, calm as ever, her footsteps echoing down the corridors of Rome, carrying both her son's future and her own downfall in the same steady breath. He grew up among echoes, not laughter. Lucius's childhood was shaped not by sunlight or song, but by whispers behind half-closed doors. The world he inherited was too large for a child filled with the ghosts of ancestors, the quiet tremor of politics, and the constant awareness that everything around him was fragile, conditional, and watched. After his father's death and his mother's exile, he was left behind a boy of noble blood, without a home of his own. His guardians were few: an aunt who spoke little, 2 loyal servants, a barber and a dancer, and silence. The villa where he lived was small by Roman standards, perched on a lonely hill overlooking the countryside. At night, he would listen to the distant hooves of soldiers passing on the road, and wonder if one day they would come for him too. There were lessons, of course, always lessons. His tutors spoke softly, as if afraid to wake something dangerous inside him. He learned to read the speeches of Cicero, to trace the lines of history, to recite the verses of poets long dead. But the words never felt alive to him. They were shadows on a wall, beautiful, but cold. What he truly learned was how to watch, how to wait, how to understand silence. Sometimes, in the late afternoons, the barber, an old man with kind eyes, would tell him stories while trimming his hair. Stories not from history books, but from the streets of Rome. Tales of markets and temples, of people who lived without crowns and spoke freely. Lucius would listen quietly, trying to imagine that freedom, the scent of fresh bread and sea air, instead of marble and fear. Other times, the dancer would show him how movement could be a kind of speech, a way to express what one could never say aloud. She would sway gently in the fading light, the dust rising around her like gold. He watched, fascinated by the way beauty could exist without power, how grace needed no throne. But such moments were fleeting, like sunlight through a crack in stone. When news of his mother reached him, it came in fragments, a letter whispered through servants, a rumor carried by merchants. He was told she was safe, then told she was dangerous, then told nothing at all. Sometimes he dreamed of her standing on a shore, the sea behind her, her gaze fixed on him like a command. In those dreams, he felt both loved and owned. As he grew, Rome itself seemed to change with him. Emperors rose and fell. Names once spoken with reverence became curses. He learned early that loyalty was a costume, easily worn and easily discarded. Each day, he felt the empire's breath warm and cold at once, pressing against the window of his small borrowed room. In the evenings, he would climb to the roof and looked toward the horizon where the city lay. Even from afar, he could sense its pulse, the faint glow of torches, the drifting hum of life that never truly slept. He wondered if she was thinking of him. He wondered what kind of man she wanted him to become. The household kept few luxuries, but one thing he cherished: a small bronze lyre slightly out of tune, a relic from his father's time. When no one was listening, he would pluck its strings softly, the sound trembling like the breath of memory. He did not play for joy, he played for understanding, as if the music could tell him who he was meant to be. He would close his eyes and imagine the marble halls of Rome, the shining banquets, the distant laughter, the power he had only heard about. Somewhere inside him, a quiet hunger began to form, not for cruelty, not yet, but for belonging, to be seen, to be chosen, to be loved by the world that had forgotten him. But childhood has a way of ending quietly. One evening, a messenger arrived, not a soldier, not a friend, just a man in dusty robes who bowed deeply and spoke his mother's name. Agrippina had returned to power. She was calling for her son. That night, Lucius lay awake, staring at the ceiling where moonlight traced patterns across the plaster. He felt both fear and hope, tangled together like vines. He did not know it yet, but the gentle stillness of his youth, the soft air, the humble meals, the silence that had once protected him was over. Outside, the wind shifted, the lamps flickered. Somewhere beyond the hills, Rome was waking, and with it, the long shadow of destiny began to move. The city did not roar when Agrippina returned. It murmured. Rome, that restless heart of empire, seemed to hold its breath as her carriage passed through the forum beneath a veil of dusk. The wheels turned slowly over the cobblestones. The horses snorted into the cold air. People watched from the shadows, not cheering, not cursing, only watching. For in her presence, they felt something greater than power. They felt inevitability. Agrippina had come home, but not as exile redeemed. She came as something quieter and far more dangerous, as a vision of control, polished to mirror brightness. Years of silence had honed her. Years of patience had wrapped her ambition in silk. Now, even the Senate whispered her name with caution. The palace smelled of oil and marble when she entered again. Torches flickered against the walls. The sound of sandals echoed like distant waves. Courtiers bowed as she passed, unsure whether they were greeting a woman or the shadow of destiny itself. Claudius, aging, uncertain, still haunted by the ghosts of his former wife, awaited her at the end of a long corridor. When they met, the air thickened with ceremony. He spoke softly, words rehearsed by advisors and fate alike. She answered with grace, neither warm nor cold, the kind of composure that makes even silence sound obedient. The emperor saw in her what she intended him to see: safety disguised as devotion, tenderness wrapped around steel. The forbidden nature of their bond hung in the air like perfume. Uncle and niece, bound by both blood and ambition, stood before the altars of Jupiter as priests muttered uneasy prayers. The ceremony was quiet, almost reverent. No cheers rose from the crowd. No music accompanied the vows. Only the sound of fabric shifting, the faint clang of gold ornaments, and the steady breath of two people reshaping history under the guise of affection. As Claudius placed the ring upon her finger, Agrippina's eyes did not waver. She understood the language of this union, that love was a transaction, that trust was currency, that every tender word was a tool. In that moment, she was no longer the exile, nor the widow, nor the niece. She was Empress of Rome. But the stillness that followed was uneasy. Even marble seems to sense the weight of forbidden things. The wedding feast glittered with gold and song, yet beneath the music ran a hum of fear, courtiers smiling too widely, servants stepping too softly. everyone pretending this union was a blessing. Only the gods, perhaps, knew it was a curse dressed in ceremony. That same night, the palace corridors glowed faintly in torchlight. Lucius, the boy she had raised on the promise of greatness, walked beside her through halls that smelled of myrrh and stone. His steps were careful, his face pale with awe. He had never seen such grandeur ceilings painted with constellations, fountains murmuring in inner courtyards, guards gleaming like statues. Agrippina's hand rested on his shoulder. "Look well," she said softly. "This will one day be yours." Her tone carried neither love nor pride, only certainty, cold and luminous. The boy said nothing, but in the marble reflection of a torch he saw his own face beside hers, and for a moment they looked the same. The next morning, the ritual of adoption began. Claudius, Emperor of Rome, seated upon his ivory throne, announced that Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus would henceforth be his son and heir. The hall was vast, filled with the sound of formal applause, hollow, careful, restrained. Priests recited words older than the empire itself, words meant to sanctify bloodlines and erase the past. As they spoke, Agrippina watched. She stood perfectly still, her face unreadable, her pulse steady. The words washed over her like the tide she had long predicted. She had waited for this moment through exile, marriage, and loss. Now, as the boy kneeled before the emperor, she could almost hear the click of destiny falling into place, quiet, precise, irreversible. Lucius Roacer. The emperor laid a hand upon his shoulder and spoke the name that would carry him through history. Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. The room seemed to exhale. The crowd bowed. The trumpet sounded once, low and mournful, as if Rome itself understood what had just begun. When they returned to their chambers that evening, Agrippina dismissed her attendants and stood before a polished mirror. The lamplight drew gold across her face, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. Outside, the city slept beneath its endless stars, unaware that a single new name had already begun to shift the weight of empire. In the adjoining room, Nero, still more boy than man, sat awake by the window. He could not sleep. The crown of inheritance had been placed upon him without his consent, and though he felt its light, he also sensed its shadow. From the garden below, the wind carried the faint murmur of Rome at night, the whisper of power moving unseen. He thought of his mother's hand guiding him, the coldness in her calm voice, the soft pressure of her expectation. Somewhere deep inside, he felt a flicker of unease, a small, trembling question. Was this destiny, or was it a cage? But he did not yet know how to answer. So he did what children do when the world grows too large. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of his own breathing, trying to find peace inside the machinery of fate. Outside, the torches of the palace burned low, and the marble floors held the last warmth of the day. Rome was silent, but it was not at rest. Something had shifted, quietly, forever. The day began like any other in the palace. The sun drifted through thin curtains, scattering light across bowls of fruit, half-drained goblets, and scrolls left open on tables. Slaves whispered in the corridors, carrying trays of polished silver. Somewhere deep within the halls, the emperor was preparing for supper, unaware that this ordinary evening would be his last. They said Claudius loved mushrooms. He called them the food of the gods, a delicacy soft and pale, rich and fragrant. Perhaps that was why Agrippina chose them. There is a certain poetry in letting a man die by the thing he loves. The dish was served in silence. As always, golden plates gleaming, candles steady, the hum of conversation measured and slow. Claudius lifted his fork, smiled faintly, and ate. No one in the room moved differently. The servants poured wine with steady hands, The guests spoke of the weather, the Senate, the harvest. Only Agrippina's gaze lingered, her face carved into serenity. To watch death arrive requires discipline. The poison, gentle at first, began its quiet work beneath the emperor's ribs, a warmth that bloomed into ache, then into something darker. He coughed once, then again. Someone laughed at a distant joke. The sound dissolved into an uneasy silence. Claudius touched his throat, blinking as though the world had tilted slightly. The cup trembled in his hand. For a moment, he looked not like an emperor, but like an old man, surprised by his own fragility. Agrippina's smile did not change. She leaned forward with practiced grace, her voice calm, her hand light upon his arm. "You've had enough wine, my lord," she murmured, the tone of a wife concerned for her husband's comfort. Then she gestured for the servants to clear the table. Somewhere in the shadows, a woman approached a physician, they said, or perhaps something else. She carried a feather, dipped in a thin, bitter liquid. Under the guise of easing his sickness, she pressed it to his throat. He gagged softly. The feather slid deeper. The poison did the rest. Outside, the lamps flickered as the evening wind passed through the open windows. The faint sound of a fountain echoed in the distance. Inside, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The emperor's fingers clutched at the table, then relaxed. His cup rolled across the marble floor with a hollow sound that seemed to last forever. No one screamed. No one dared to. When the last tremor left his body, the silence that followed was heavy, sacred, unbroken. Somewhere in the room, a candle hissed as its wax reached the end of the wick. A small sound, almost tender, as if the universe were closing its eyes. They carried him away before dawn. The corridors were lit with a single line of torches, their flames bowing with the draft. Agrippina walked behind the body, her face hidden beneath a veil. She did not look down. Her steps were measured, her breath slow. By morning, she would be both widow and empress, mother, two roles perfectly suited to her, each feeding the other. At 17, her son was crowned. The ceremony was brief, perfumed, precise. Senators wept in practiced tones. The people cheered because they were told to. Nero stood tall beneath the golden canopy, his expression a mix of wonder and emptiness. The crown was heavy, though he pretended not to feel it. His mother watched from behind the silk curtain, her eyes reflecting the light of 1,000 torches. As the last words of the oath faded, she smiled small, invisible, the smile of someone who has reached the summit of a long, perilous climb. Around her, the empire bowed. Yet in that moment, if one listened closely, there was no joy in her breath, only relief. Power, when finally held, is colder than one imagines. It does not sing, it does not glow. It sits in the palm like ice that never melts, beautiful and merciless. When night fell, Nero sat alone in his chambers. The palace that had once seemed endless now felt too quiet, too large. He ran a finger along the gold thread of his new robe, tracing its weight. In the next room, he could hear his mother speaking softly to advisors, her tone steady and sure. Her words were shaping his reign before he had even begun to rule. He stared at the reflection of the crown upon the polished bronze of the table. The metal gleamed faintly in the candlelight, as if alive. He reached out, touched it, and felt nothing. Somewhere outside, the first cry of an owl broke the night. The sound drifted through the halls, long and lonely. The empire had changed hands. The world continued, quietly, as though nothing had happened. At first, it seemed as though the empire itself had drawn a deep, cleansing breath. The old emperor was gone. The air around Rome felt lighter, fragrant, touched by the delicate promise of youth. People spoke the new name Nero with hesitant hope, as though saying it softly might protect the fragile dawn it carried. In those first months, mercy became fashionable again. Taxes were lowered, exiles returned home, prison doors opened to the sound of prayers and disbelief. The Senate applauded him, calling it the rebirth of Roman virtue. Poets wrote verses comparing the young emperor to Apollo, the god of light and harmony. Children played in the streets beneath garlands of olive and laurel, and even the wind seemed gentler, as though it too wished to believe. Nero was only 17. He stood before the crowds on the marble balcony, golden light touching his face, and spoke of peace. He told them he wished to rule with compassion, that Rome should be a home, not a burden. His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar weight of being loved. Below him, thousands of faces turned upward, full of trust. His first decree was simple. There would be no executions without his consent. He signed it with a careful hand, then whispered to his tutor, Seneca, "How I wish I had never learned to write." The words spread like fragrance through the city, an emperor who mourned even the thought of death. In the Senate, men nodded approvingly. In the streets, mothers whispered to their children that perhaps the gods had sent a gentler soul at last. Agrippina watched from behind her veil, her eyes unreadable. This peace, this mercy, this warmth, they were her design. She had guided every gesture, every decree, every public smile. Nero was her masterpiece, her creation made flesh. And for a time, it worked. The empire exhaled. The scars of fear faded, if only on the surface. The young emperor loved music more than law, art more than conquest. He held concerts in the palace gardens, invited poets to dine by candlelight, encouraged painters and philosophers to speak freely. He wandered the corridors of marble, humming melodies of his own invention, dreaming of a Rome that sang instead of marched. When the night air cooled, he walked among the statues of his ancestors, their silent gazes cast in stone. Sometimes he would stop before one of them, Augustus perhaps, and whisper, "I will be better than all of you," not in cruelty, but in beauty. He truly believed that art could make him eternal, that kindness could make him beloved. The people adored their young ruler. Festivals filled the streets, fountains overflowed with wine, and coins stamped with his serene profile passed from hand to hand. They called it the Aurea Aetas, the Golden Age reborn. The city glowed with celebration, as if it had forgotten what shadows were. But beneath the light, the old machinery of fear continued to turn, quiet and patient. The Praetorian guards still watched, still listened. Senators still calculated their loyalties. And in the heart of the palace, Agrippina's hand still rested lightly upon her son's shoulder, guiding him in the direction she desired, the direction she believed Rome needed. There were moments, though, when Nero felt the faint pull of unease. Sometimes, late at night, he would rise from bed and walk to the balcony overlooking the city. Below, the torches burned like a sea of trembling stars. He could hear laughter, music, distant echoes of joy, and yet, something felt missing. The silence between the sounds unsettled him, as though the city's devotion were too perfect, too rehearsed. He would close his eyes, trying to remember the voice of his mother, before it hardened into ambition. The scent of the sea near Antium, the gentle stories of his childhood. But those memories were fading, their softness replaced by the marble chill of power. And so the days went on, calm, golden, almost unreal. Rome glimmered like a painting bathed in morning light, its beauty untouched, its surface serene. Yet somewhere beneath that beauty, a current began to stir deep, dark, inevitable. For now, though, the empire dreamed. It dreamed of youth and kindness, of art and peace. It dreamed of an emperor who smiled rather than ruled. And in that dream, the seeds of tragedy were already quietly taking root. There is a silence that grows between people long before they speak of hatred. Between Nero and Agrippina, it began softly, a shadow stretching across their dinners, a breath of cold between words that once aligned like mirrors. The mother still smiled, the son still bowed, but the warmth between them had thinned, delicate as glass. For years, she had shaped him. Every gesture, every decree, every word spoken before the Senate had carried her unseen touch. When he smiled, the people saw a son of light, but behind the curtain, her voice guided each motion, like a musician behind a screen playing another's song. Yet the boy who once listened now began to hear something else, the faint echo of his own will. It came to him in fragments, the laughter of his friends, the wild scent of theater nights, the thrill of music unapproved by courtly ears. He began to taste what freedom might feel like, and it was intoxicating. Agrippina sensed it at once. Mothers always do. But instead of holding him softly, she gripped harder, her guidance turning to warning, her counsel to command. She reminded him that Rome was fragile, that love was dangerous, that his image belonged not to himself, but to the empire. Her words, once protective, now sounded like chains. Nero listened, but his gaze drifted to the window, where the faint glow of the city pulsed like an invitation. Somewhere beyond those walls, people lived without crowns, laughed, wept, and danced without consequence. He envied them. Soon, whispers reached him. "She rules through you." Senators spoke of her influence in cautious tones. Slaves repeated her name like a spell. Even his beloved Poppaea, beautiful and silver-tongued, whispered poison into his ear. "You will never be emperor while she breathes." Agrippina felt the distance widen, though she would never admit fear. In the palace corridors, she walked slower, her presence still regal, her scent of myrrh and iron lingering after she passed. But the guards no longer bowed as deeply, and messengers now carried news to her son before they came to her. There is no sound louder than a door closing softly on love. The final act began not with rage, but with ceremony. Nero, feigning reconciliation, invited his mother to a festival at Baiae, a celebration by the sea. She arrived radiant, draped in jewels, her smile sharp with hope. She believed her son had remembered his devotion, that the tension would dissolve beneath the salt air and the music of the waves. The night glittered with torches. Perfume and laughter drifted across the bay. From the shore, a great ship awaited her return, a gift, Nero said, built especially for her comfort. She stepped aboard as musicians played, her attendants laughing softly, unaware of the hollow beneath their feet. Out at sea, the sky was clear and wide. The stars glimmered on the water like coins cast by the gods. Then a sound, a crack, gentle at first, then thunderous. The roof of the cabin, weighted with hidden lead, collapsed inward with a shattering sigh. Screams tore the calm night open. Agrippina's friend Acella was crushed where she sat. Others leapt into the dark, swallowed by the sea. But Agrippina, daughter of emperors, sister of gods, did not panic. The instinct that had carried her through exile and poison awakened once more. She crawled from the wreckage, her hands bleeding, the scent of salt and oil in her hair. The ship lurched again, wood splintered. Soldiers' voices echoed through the night, searching, shouting. She understood then this was no accident. Her son had written her death into the sea. Still, she did not scream his name. She slipped into the water, the silk of her gown tangling around her legs, dragging her down. The waves were cold, heavy with memory. She kicked upward, gasping, and began to swim not away from death, but toward the faint line of shore glimmering under the moon. Each stroke was a prayer, each breath a defiance. Behind her, the burning wreck drifted like a floating tomb. Ahead, the sand waited pale, silent, merciful. When she reached it, she lay for a long time, her chest heaving, her hair clinging to her face. Somewhere in the distance, the sea whispered her son's name. They found her the next night in her villa, still drenched, still proud. The soldiers entered without warning, torches shaking in their hands. She rose slowly from her couch, her expression calm, her voice composed. "So," she said, "my son has decided the empire has no room for its mother." She touched her stomach, a quiet gesture, not of fear, but remembrance. "Strike my womb first," she told them, "that it may be the first to feel the justice it created." Her words fell into the air like ashes, heavy and eternal. When the swords came down, the room filled not with noise, but with an almost holy stillness, the hush of an empire watching its own reflection break. Outside, the sea rolled against the shore, tireless, unchanged. The moonlight trembled on the waves, soft as breath. And in that trembling light, the last trace of Agrippina, the younger mother, empress, architect of destiny, dissolved quietly into history. There are moments in history when beauty begins to rot slowly, softly, as though even light has grown tired of its own perfection. For Rome, those years began with music. The empire glittered under Nero's reign, but the shine was deceptive. It was not the brightness of dawn, but of gold melting in a fire too hot to last. Everywhere, there was splendor silk on the walls, pearls sewn into robes, and banquets so rich they felt more like ceremonies for forgetting. In the gardens of the Palatine, nights stretched endlessly. The emperor loved to perform. He would stand beneath a canopy of perfumed lamps, a lyre in his hands, his voice trembling with practiced passion. Courtiers applauded until their palms bled. Poets compared his singing to the music of the gods, and no one dared to disagree. To be silent was dangerous, to leave early, unforgivable. The scent of wine and roses filled the air. Guests reclined on couches draped in crimson silk, watching dancers move like smoke across the marble floors. Musicians played slow, hypnotic melodies, and the emperor's laughter, low, deliberate, echoed through the halls like a charm cast to keep fear at bay. But the laughter never lasted. Beyond the feasts, whispers crawled through the corridors. Those who once advised Nero began to vanish, their estates seized, their names erased. The mercy that had once defined his youth was now a ghost haunting the palace walls. He had learned the dangerous truth of power, that cruelty, when exercised quietly, feels almost like art. By candlelight, decrees were signed with steady hands, executions dressed as justice, confiscations as reform, each command written in ink that might as well have been blood. And yet, the emperor still played his music, still sang of beauty and love, while the city outside held its breath. There were dinners that lasted until dawn. Tables glowed with gold and onyx, and servants poured wine into cups that overflowed and stained the marble red. In those hours, the line between ecstasy and despair blurred completely. Senators toasted the emperor's divine genius, their smiles tight, their eyes hollow. Sometimes Nero himself seemed lost within his own illusion. He would gaze at his reflection in polished bronze, the curls, the jewels, the painted eyes, and murmur, "The world will remember my face." But even then, there was a strange weariness behind his beauty, as though he was beginning to feel the weight of the crown he had once worn so lightly. Outside the palace, Rome began to decay in quiet luxury. New theaters rose while aqueducts cracked. Marble gleamed while granaries emptied. The people still adored their emperor, or pretended to, because his performances were cheaper than bread and far more dazzling. The city's nights became slower, thicker, dreamlike. Music drifted through the air like incense. Laughter floated above the hum of hunger. Behind silk curtains, small tragedies unfolded, a whisper of betrayal here, a muffled cry there. Servants learned to move soundlessly, carrying secrets heavier than gold. And yet, beneath the decay, there was still beauty aching, luminous beauty. A candle trembling beside a half-finished poem, a broken lyre string quivering in silence. The emperor, seated alone at the end of a banquet, tracing patterns in spilled wine as though trying to read his own fate in its reflection. The empire glittered, but its light had grown strange, too rich, too soft, like sunlight passing through smoke. Everything seemed slowed, suspended, unreal. Rome was dreaming, but the dream was turning dark. The night the city burned, the air itself seemed to breathe fire. It began quietly, as all great disasters do, a single spark in a warehouse by the Circus Maximus, a flicker that might have died with the wind. But the wind did not come. It stayed still, heavy, as if holding its breath, and in that stillness, the flame grew. Rome was a city of wood and oil, of cloth awnings and narrow streets where whispers carried faster than prayers. The first smoke curled through the alleys like a serpent of light. Dogs barked. A child woke. Somewhere, a man tried to stamp out the flame, but by then the gods had already chosen their stage. By midnight, the horizon glowed. The Tiber reflected it like molten bronze, and the domes and columns, once white as bone, were bathed in orange and gold. The sound was not screaming, not yet, but the low murmur of something alive and vast. Roofs fell, statues melted. The air smelled of cedar and ash. Some said Nero watched from the tower of Maecenas. Others swore he stood upon his balcony, eyes lit with the same color as the flames. The truth is quieter, harder to see. Perhaps he simply watched as any artist might, transfixed by the terrible beauty of destruction. For there was beauty, even then. The fire moved like a living mind, twisting, devouring, illuminating. Sparks drifted upward into the black sky, like souls unanchored, like tiny suns seeking new heavens. It did not roar, it sang, a hymn of endings, of beginnings, of all that must burn before being reborn. The people fled, their voices lost in the roar of collapsing walls. Mothers carried infants through rivers of smoke. Old men clutched their gods to their chests. Soldiers formed lines to save the palaces, but the heat laughed at their order. Marble cracked like bone. Bronze doors sagged and wept. From his high vantage, Nero could see the city like a canvas, undone streets vanishing into flame, temples shimmering like dying stars. He said, perhaps to himself, "At last, the old Rome burns away," and someone frightened, loyal, or both brought him a lyre. He played softly. The music, carried by hot wind, was half lost in the chaos. Some said it was a lament for the city. Others said it was joy, but maybe it was neither. Maybe, as the world fell apart beneath him, Nero was searching for meaning in the one thing he understood: performance. The flames moved closer to the Palatine, but the emperor did not flinch. To him, it was not destruction, it was revelation. The city that had crowned him, imprisoned him, and adored him was showing its truth at last. Impermanence, fragility, the beauty of ruin. When dawn came, the fire still burned. Ash lay thick on the ground, soft as snow. Columns stood like blackened ribs against the grey light. People wandered through the silence barefoot, hollow-eyed, carrying nothing but memory. From a distance, Rome looked less like a city and more like a wound that refused to close. Nero descended at last. He moved among the ruins, surrounded by guards and silence. He spoke of rebuilding a new city of marble and symmetry, with streets wide enough for air to move freely, where fire could never corner them again. His voice was calm, almost tender, as though he were describing a dream. And in truth, perhaps he did dream, for out of that ruin, he saw possibility, a chance to remake the world in his image, to turn destruction into creation. To him, fire was not an end, but a brushstroke. But to those who had lost everything, it was the sound of judgment itself. They would never forget the sight of him standing above the flames, his figure outlined by the inferno's glow, not as a savior, not as a villain, but as something older than both. A man who mistook beauty for meaning. When the last embers died, the city lay quiet once more. Smoke drifted like veils through the ruins. Somewhere, a harp string snapped in the cooling air, and in that sound, thin, final, vanishing Rome exhaled what remained of its old soul. After the fire, Nero built a palace so vast that Rome itself seemed to kneel before it. They called it the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, though gold was only one of its languages. Marble from Greece, ivory from Africa, pearls from the East. Water flowed through its halls as though the Tiber had bent its course to serve him. The ceilings glittered with stars of mosaic. The walls shimmered with scenes of gods and nymphs, and in the center of it all stood a lake so still it seemed carved from light. The emperor would walk there at dawn, barefoot, his robe trailing across the polished floors. He said he wished to live, as man should live among the gods. But in truth, the palace was not built for the gods, nor for Rome. It was built for silence, for the city that once roared now whispered. The people had lost their homes. Their temples were still black with soot. When they looked upon the Golden House, they saw not beauty, but reminder that their emperor had turned their ashes into mirrors for himself. Yet Nero called it his gift. He hosted feasts beneath ceilings that revolved with hidden gears, releasing showers of petals and perfume. He ordered banquets where guests reclined on crystal couches, while the floor itself turned beneath them like a living stage. Every sound, a harp, a sigh, a goblet's ring, echoed through corridors built not for joy, but for awe. But awe, when repeated, becomes loneliness. At night, he would wander the gardens, lit by torches that never seemed to burn out. Statues of gods looked down upon him with patient, sightless eyes. He spoke to them sometimes, softly, as if seeking approval that no longer came from men. The scent of cedar and oil clung to his hands, and the gold dust from frescoes stained his robe. When he paused before the great statue at the entrance, his own likeness, towering 100 feet high, cast in bronze, he often stood for a long while, neither proud nor ashamed. "This," he whispered once, "is what remains when one tries to outshine the Sunday." The words lingered in the air, unanswered. Inside, the palace was perfect and perfectly empty. The laughter of servants died before reaching the walls. The music of flutes echoed without warmth. The pools reflected his face again and again, until he no longer recognized which was real. Beauty surrounded him so completely that it began to erase him. Outside, Rome was being rebuilt in his image. Broad avenues, marble forums, symmetry in every line. The emperor's vision was everywhere, yet nowhere was the pulse of life. Even the markets felt rehearsed, their laughter careful, their prayers soft, as though the whole city were performing for him alone. Seneca, his old tutor, had once warned him, "A man who builds a golden world will one day live in its silence." But Seneca was gone now, his letters burned, his wisdom turned to memory, and Nero, the artist, the dreamer, the orphan of ambition, stood in his palace surrounded by everything he had ever wanted, and felt nothing at all. Sometimes, as the sun set, he would climb to the highest terrace of the Golden House and look toward the horizon. The rebuilt city glowed beneath him like a crown of embers. The wind moved softly across the gardens, stirring the scent of roses planted where homes had once stood. He would close his eyes, listening to the faint hum of fountains, and imagine the voices of those who had once lived there, laughter, argument, the small music of ordinary life. But only the wind answered. The golden house gleamed, vast and hollow, a monument not to triumph but to the cost of it. Every jewel, every pillar, every drop of perfume was bought with a silence too deep to break. In the end, it was not the fire that destroyed Rome, but the echo that followed, the echo of beauty built upon grief. And in that echo, Nero walked alone, crowned by light and emptiness, the emperor of a golden shell. At first, the tremor was faint, a rumor carried on the wind, a whisper that few dared repeat. But empires do not collapse with noise. They fade quietly, like breath leaving the body of a sleeping giant. By the year 67, the golden glow that had once surrounded Nero began to dim. In the far provinces in Gaul, in Spain, even in Africa, governors and generals started to murmur that the emperor no longer ruled with reason, that Rome deserved something steadier than song. Yet in the palace, Nero still believed his reflection. The mirrors told him he was adored. The silence of his courtiers confirmed it. He continued to sing. He composed verses about peace and glory, performed for guests who watched with trembling smiles, each afraid that the wrong expression might be their last. When he lifted his lyre, they applauded on cue. When he paused, they held their breath. The music was beautiful, too beautiful, but beneath it, something fragile began to crack. The empire was still vast, still radiant, but the light had grown cold. Taxes rose to fund his festivals. Soldiers went unpaid while gold flowed into theaters. The Praetorians, once his shield, now whispered of lost honor. The Senate met in silence, the marble halls echoing with unspoken resentment. Yet Nero moved among them with the serene confidence of a dreamer who mistakes silence for loyalty. Each night, he wandered through the golden house, its halls so large that his footsteps came back to him as echoes, soft, delayed, uncertain. It was there that the first sound of unraveling reached him. Not rebellion, not accusation, but absence. Friends stopped writing. Messengers arrived later and later. The city grew quiet in his presence, as if holding back its breath. Loneliness rarely announces itself. It begins in the smallest spaces between words, between glances, between the final note of a song and the applause that no longer comes. When news finally arrived that the legions in Gaul had raised their own banner, Nero laughed. "They sing a false tune," he said. "They forget who taught them rhythm." But there was no music in his laughter, only exhaustion. He ordered new celebrations, grander spectacles, louder hymns. If Rome was trembling, he would drown the sound beneath his art. Yet art could not silence the truth. Reports multiplied: another province in revolt, another governor refusing orders. Spain now followed Gaul, its armies swearing allegiance to a new name whispered like prayer: Galba. The name rolled through the empire like a low drumbeat, steady and inevitable. When Nero performed next, even the applause sounded wrong, thin, delayed, polite. He felt it in his chest like a cold wind, the realization that devotion cannot be commanded forever. For the first time, he saw not love in the audience's eyes, but calculation. Fear was no longer working. The nights grew longer. The emperor's once boundless energy faded into restless pacing. He began talking to statues again, to his own portraits, to ghosts of his mother and wives. He asked them whether they still believed in him, whether his art would outlive the lies. The marble did not answer. In the Senate, men spoke carefully now, choosing words like surgeons, precise, bloodless. afraid to cut too deep. They knew what was coming, but not yet when. Even his guards grew distant, bowing slower, avoiding his gaze. The empire trembled, softly but completely. It was not the sound of battle, but of faith unraveling, a quiet dissonance that spread from soldier to senator, from servant to slave. Each man, in his own way, stopped believing that the emperor's light could return, and Nero, standing before his mirror, still whispered to his reflection, "They love me still." But the reflection did not move. Outside, thunder rolled above the city, slow, low, and distant. The kind of thunder that does not bring rain, only the heavy silence before a storm. When Rome began to turn its back on him, Nero sought solace not in war or counsel, but in art. He declared that he would journey to Greece, the land of music, of marble, of divine applause, to show the world that he was not only an emperor, but a creator of beauty. The empire trembled, but he heard only the rhythm of his own ambition. It was meant to be a tour of triumph. In his mind, Greece was still the cradle of grace, a place where the lyre could heal what swords could not. He arrived not as ruler, but as performer crowned with laurel, dressed in silk the color of sunset. At each city he entered, trumpets sounded, flowers fell, and citizens bowed before him, unsure whether they were greeting a god or indulging a madman. Nero sang in Corinth, raced chariots in Olympia, recited poetry in Delphi beneath the whispering pines. Everywhere, he won. The judges crowned him again and again. First place, best actor, finest voice. When he tripped during a race and failed to finish, they still awarded him the laurel for his divine intention. He smiled, believing the world at last understood him. To those around him, the journey felt like a fevered dream, endless pageants, endless flattery. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and exhaustion. Senators followed in silence, scribes recorded every note, and servants carried the emperor's instruments like relics. He had built in Rome a palace of marble. In Greece, he built a stage made of longing. Between performances, Nero would walk the beaches of the Aegean, his sandals sinking into the white sand. The sea whispered against his ankles, patient and eternal. He spoke aloud to it sometimes, as if the waves could understand him better than men. "They will remember my art," he said softly, "even if they forget my name." The sea, of course, gave no answer, only the sound of water returning to itself. And yet, there was something almost tender in his delusion. He was a man who had once held the world in his hands, now chasing the faint echo of applause. Perhaps he truly believed that beauty could forgive cruelty, that if he could sing perfectly, if he could make them weep, all the rest would fade. The Greeks, kind and cautious, played their part. They cheered until their voices broke, placed crowns upon his head, and called him Nero the Radiant. He accepted it all with the calm joy of a child finally praised. He did not see the pity behind their smiles. When his tour ended, Nero gathered the trophies, hundreds of crowns, garlands, medals, and returned to Rome as though returning from conquest. He ordered a triumphal parade, like those of old generals. The chariot that had once carried Augustus through cheering crowds now bore a singer wrapped in silk, his hands calloused not by battle but by strings of a lyre. Rome watched in silence. Some laughed quietly behind closed shutters. Others simply turned away. The emperor who once inspired fear now inspired fatigue. His golden voice could not mask the hunger in the streets, nor the whispers of rebellion echoing through the Senate halls. But Nero did not hear them. He was lost in his own music, a melody so soft and sad that even time seemed to pause for him. For all his crimes, there was something heartbreakingly human in that final song. A man standing before eternity, asking to be loved not as ruler, but as artist. The parade ended beneath a grey sky. The flowers that lined the streets were already wilting. Nero lifted one of his crowns, now bent and dull from overuse, and looked at it with quiet wonder. "How light it feels," he murmured. "Lighter than a crown should be." He smiled faintly, unaware that it was not glory he carried home from Greece, but the soft shadow of farewell. It was June, and Rome no longer dreamed of him. The emperor who had once filled its marble streets with song now hid in the shadow of a crumbling villa. 4 miles outside the city he had once owned like a reflection. The night air was heavy and wet. Crickets sang where courtiers once applauded. A single candle trembled on a cracked table, its flame bending to the breath of his fear. Nero was no longer surrounded by senators or guards, only by 4 men who had not yet found the courage to leave. Epaphroditus, his secretary, sat in silence near the door. Phaon, the freedman whose home this was, stared at the floor. A valet, a servant, and Sporus, the pale, frightened boy dressed in a woman's robe, waited, listening. They had carried him here through back roads and fields, running from a city that now hunted its god. The candle hissed softly, burning low. Outside, the dogs barked. Far away, the faint echo of hooves pressed against the soil soldiers approaching, the sound muffled like a heartbeat through walls of earth. Nero lifted his head, his face pale as wax. "Are they close?" he asked. No one answered. He pressed his trembling fingers against the table. "I am still Caesar," he whispered, as though naming himself could keep the world from ending. But names, like empires, can lose their power in a single night. His voice wavered between defiance and pleading. "They will not kill me. They cannot. I am their voice. I am..." He stopped. The words turned brittle in the air. In the corner, Sporus wept quietly, his painted face streaked with tears. Nero looked at him at the strange reflection of all he had destroyed, and for a moment, pity flickered in his eyes. "Do not cry," he murmured. "We are only acting out the end of the play." He tried to smile, but the muscles refused. The smell of earth and candle wax filled the room. His robe, once bright with embroidery, was torn and smeared with mud. The man who had ruled the world could no longer lift his voice above a whisper. Epaphroditus approached, his voice low and urgent. "Caesar, they are coming. You must act now." Nero stared at him as though from another world. "To act?" he said. "I have spent my life acting." He rose unsteadily. His knees shook, his body thinner than it had ever been. "They will not take me alive," he said, though his tone carried no conviction. He looked around the dim room, his gaze lingering on the small objects scattered across the table. A bronze cup, a knife, a strip of cloth. All ordinary things, but to him they looked like symbols in a forgotten ritual. "They called me a monster," he said softly, to no one in particular. "But I only wanted them to love me, to listen." No one answered. Only the candle moved, its flame shrinking to a nervous tremor. Then came the sound closer now, the horses, the armor, the steady rhythm of inevitability. The freedman made the sign of the cross, though quietly, as if afraid to draw attention. Nero turned to Epaphroditus. His lips were dry. "Do it with me," he said. "Guide my hand." The dagger lay on the table, gleaming faintly in the candlelight. He lifted it, hesitated, and let it fall. "How hard it is to die," he murmured, his voice trembling like a child's. "They will not show mercy," Epaphroditus said. "Better your own hand than theirs." Nero nodded faintly, as though agreeing with a distant thought. He picked up the blade again, pressed it to his throat, and froze. The door rattled. Voices outside, shouts, commands, the scrape of metal, the sound of the empire arriving to witness its own reflection. "Now," whispered Epaphroditus. Nero closed his eyes. His hand moved, a flash of steel, a cry, half swallowed by blood. He fell backward against the wall, the dagger slipping from his grasp. He tried to speak, but only a gurgle came. Epaphroditus knelt beside him, pushing the blade deeper to end the agony. The candle flickered once, then steadied. Blood pooled darkly across the stone. Nero's lips moved again, faintly shaping the words history would remember. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. He smiled not with triumph, but with bewildered relief, as though death itself were an audience finally applauding. Outside, the soldiers burst through the gate. Their torches lit the room in sudden gold. They found a corpse in royal robes, surrounded by frightened servants, and a boy in silk, kneeling, unmoving. The emperor's eyes were half open, fixed on nothing. The candle's flame bowed once more, then went out. Rome had its peace again, but the silence that followed did not feel like victory. It felt like the breath between acts, a pause too long, too human. And in that stillness, somewhere beyond the reach of empire, the night closed its hand around a fallen god. When dawn came, the city was quiet, not the silence of fear, but something gentler, the sound that follows after a long storm, when the wind is too tired to move and the world, for a breath, forgets how to tremble. Rome had woken to a new day without its emperor. They found his body already buried by loyal hands, a shallow grave outside the villa where he had died. No ceremony, no marble tomb, no song, only a patch of earth disturbed, a few wilted leaves, and a broken branch marking where a god had fallen. The news spread slowly, carried by whispers rather than trumpets. Some wept, others only nodded. Most said nothing at all. In the Senate, they called him enemy of the state. His statues were torn down, his name struck from inscriptions, his face scraped from coins. The empire, eager to cleanse itself, began to erase him, the way dawn erases a shadow. But even as his likeness vanished, something strange lingered, a quiet, uneasy relief, tinged with sorrow. For a generation that had grown under his rule, even terror had become a kind of rhythm. Now, the rhythm was gone. Rome breathed again, but it did not yet know how to sing. The streets slowly filled with sound, the voices of workers rebuilding, the creak of carts carrying stone, the laughter of children who had never seen the emperor's face. Gardens began to bloom again among the ruins. The air smelled of plaster dust and olive smoke. There were still scars everywhere, the walls blackened by fire. The houses collapsed by greed, but time had begun its quiet work of softening. In those early months, poets wrote, not of Nero, but of peace. They spoke of balance, of patience, of the humility that follows madness. Historians, pen in hand, struggled to describe him. Was he tyrant or dreamer, artist or destroyer? None could say for certain. Perhaps he had been all of them. Perhaps, like fire itself, he had illuminated, even as he consumed. The empire moved on, as empires always do. New rulers rose, new temples were built, and new songs replaced the old. Yet in the deep corners of Rome, in the theaters where his voice once echoed, in the gardens where his statues once gleamed, a faint sense of memory remained. Not admiration, not even forgiveness, but the quiet knowledge that all brilliance, left unchecked, burns itself away. The villa where he died was left to crumble. Grass grew over the stones, wildflowers filled the cracks. Shepherds grazed their flocks nearby, unaware of the dust beneath their feet. The world had already turned its face toward other dawns. And so, Nero, once a name shouted in triumph, later whispered in dread, became only a story. A fragile, flickering story about how power devours its dreamers, and how beauty, when forced to serve the ego, turns hollow. But even such stories, with time, begin to fade, because time is not cruel. It does not punish nor protect. It only moves, smoothing edges, washing away the sharpness of grief until even memory grows soft. The emperors and the slaves, the poets and the murderers, all become the same dust, carried by the same wind. In the end, there is no judgment, only stillness. The fire has burned out, the echoes have dimmed, and Rome once again belongs to the living. If you listen closely, in the hush before sleep, you can almost hear it, the faint hum of the city breathing again, the rustle of olive leaves, the whisper of history turning the page. The story closes not in anger, but in calm. Even monsters fade into quiet, even ruins find rest. And so, as the last embers of the empire's fever cool into ash, a voice soft, eternal murmurs through the dark. Rest now, the fire is over.